Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into a truly fascinating, completely paradigm-shifting piece of work, Carl Jung's highly complex psychological interpretation of the Book of Job. Okay, let's just get right into this, because what Jung does here is absolutely brilliant. He takes one of the oldest, most puzzling stories in the entire Judeo-Christian tradition and approaches it not as a theologian, but really as a psychological detective, trying to solve a profound mystery about the human mind. Think about it for a second. We're starting with the ultimate cosmic mystery here. Why on earth would an all-knowing, omnipotent God make a wager with Satan, effectively gambling on the back of a powerless, innocent creature? In the traditional reading, we're left staring at the seemingly senseless suffering of Job and Yahweh's totally bizarre, unjustified bet with a slanderer. It's a setup that has literally troubled readers for centuries. From a human perspective, Yahweh's behavior seems downright revolting. God allows his absolute most faithful servant to fall into this dark abyss of physical and moral suffering, all just to prove a point to a doubting thought. And this right here perfectly hits the nail on the head regarding the core paradox Jung identifies. Job expected help from God against God. Jung frames this whole narrative not just as a test of human loyalty, but as a total mind-bending contradiction. We have this mortal man who realizes he is facing two completely opposing sides of the divine. He's suffering immensely at Yahweh's hands, yet he turns to that exact same Yahweh for justice. He is literally looking for an advocate against his own persecutor. So how do we actually go about solving this mystery? Well, we're going to lean heavily on academic analysis of Jung's hermeneutics. Because Jung's main goal was the study of the soul, he argued for an approach that highlights the Bible's nature as what he called a soul book. We aren't looking at these texts as a source of strict historical narrative or absolute religious facts. Instead, we're using the tools of psychology to investigate the incredibly rich imagery and deep personalities found within its pages. Which means we really have to shift our entire paradigm. We are moving completely away from a literal reading of the text and instead embracing a psychological one. You see, for Jung, religious statements are products of the psyche. They are psychic facts. Regardless of their connection to actual historical events, they hold immense reality because they express the profound inner conflicts and structures of the human mind. The whole function of Scripture, in this view, is basically to tutor the soul and bring the reader into a much deeper state of consciousness. To pull this off, Jung uses this fascinating method known as amplification. Imagine you're a linguist trying to decode some ancient, forgotten inscription by comparing it to known texts. Jung does the exact same thing, but with symbolic experiences. By comparing the story of Job to global myths like Babylonian creation epics or Egyptian legends, he decodes the universal unconscious patterns or archetypes that are playing out in the narrative. This is what allows the text to suddenly become intelligible on a deeply psychological level. Part 1. The Amoral Antinomy of God. All right, let's profile the first main character in our detective story, Yahweh himself. Jung points out something really interesting about the text. Yahweh exhibits wildly opposing traits all at the exact same time. We see loving kindness existing right alongside extreme cruelty. We have brilliant insight paired with total obtuseness, and this incredible creative power matched equally by destructiveness. Jung argues that a condition like this is only conceivable when there is an absolute lack of reflecting consciousness. Because Yahweh doesn't self-reflect on these crazy contradictions, he basically acts as an unconscious, amoral force of nature. In this psychological framework, God is described as a totality of inner opposites, what Jung terms a coincidentia oppositorum. He is completely, totally unaware of the darkness within himself. He doesn't even realize that Satan is actually just a doubting thought originating from within his own mind. Because of this total lack of self-reflection, Yahweh is highly susceptible to Satan's provocations, which leads directly to the completely unprovoked torment of Job. Part 2. Job's moral superiority. Enter Job. He's our conscious, morally grounded guy who completely disrupts this entire cosmic dynamic, which brings us right to our central conflict. How exactly can a puny, completely defenseless human outmaneuver an all-powerful deity who literally wields thunder and lightning? Job is sitting in ashes, covered in sores, completely stripped of all his worldly power, and yet he is the one who initiates a massive shift in the psychological balance of the universe. And he manages this through sheer conscious endurance. By suffering without completely losing his moral compass or his faith in ultimate justice, Job achieves a terrifying insight into God's split nature. It becomes plainly obvious that Job knows more about God than God knows about himself. Because Job is forced to be mindful of his own absolute impotence, he develops a much keener consciousness based on self-reflection. God, on the other hand, never meeting an insuperable obstacle, never had to reflect. Through this incredible dynamic, Job establishes his own intellectual and moral superiority over his creator. As detailed in our sources, once Satan does his dirty work, he kind of just vanishes from view, relegated straight back into the unconscious. Yahweh then projects his own unfaithfulness onto Job, launching into this terrifying 71-verse display of pure omnipotence, showing off his immense power over beasts like the Leviathan and the Behemoth. But this huge, thunderous display completely misses the mark. It's really just an attempted intimidation that actually proves Yahweh is morally defeated. Job sees right through this divine unfaithfulness, realizes arguing is totally useless, and simply lays his hand over his mouth in prudent silence. Part 3. The Incarnation as Compensation. This unacknowledged moral defeat brings us to a really brilliant twist. God actually realizes he was bested. Job's superiority triggers an extraordinary evolutionary chain reaction within the collective psyche. First, Yahweh acts out unconsciously. Second, Job stands firm, which elevates human consciousness. Third, and this is such a beautiful detail, the pre-existent figure of Sophia, or divine wisdom, steps in. She helps reinforce Yahweh's much-needed self-reflection. And fourth, this major realization compels Yahweh to take a drastic step to catch up to Job's level of consciousness. He must incarnate as a human being. As Jung specifically notes, Yahweh must learn to differentiate the opposites within himself. He must become human. To resolve this immense psychological tension and to genuinely understand the suffering he caused his faithful servant, Yahweh is forced into the ultimate act of compensation. He can't just remain this abstract, omnipotent force floating in the sky. He has to become a concrete, particular individual. In Jung's commentary, the Christian incarnation is literally the direct result of Yahweh's encounter with Job. So, in Jung's view, the incarnate Christ becomes a tremendously powerful symbol of what he calls the self. Christ represents the agonizing, yet completely necessary integration between the conscious and the unconscious. Christ's dual nature as both God and human is the absolute ultimate expression of resolving these inner opposites. The suffering on the cross symbolizes the immense difficulty of this psychological integration, a profound confrontation where one-sided perfection has to finally be reconciled with the shadow. Part 4. Integrating our own shadows. So what's the big takeaway here? What does this ancient cosmic drama actually mean for your mind and my mind today? Well, the takeaways are surprisingly practical. First off, these stories reflect our own psychic reality. Jung's interpretation is a massive warning that we all have a hidden shadow, those parts of ourselves we completely refuse to acknowledge. If we, like Yahweh in the Old Testament, avoid our dark side and lack self-reflection, it inevitably leads to unconscious acting out. We just end up projecting our own faults onto everybody else. True psychological health, true wholeness, absolutely requires a union of opposites. We have to integrate both our light and our dark. Now, translating this ancient myth into a modern psychological map. It's not about destroying religion or debunking faith at all. Actually, it's the exact opposite. As Jung says, a correct interpretation is rewarded with a sudden uprush of life. When we translate these archaic, ancient symbols into concepts that our modern consciousness can actually grasp, it sparks a massive increase in meaning, vitality, and true self-awareness. Jung actually had huge respect for the effectiveness of religious symbolism, even describing religions as the great psychic systems of healing. The true authority of the Book of Job lies in its immense power to heal. It gives a framework for anyone struggling to reconcile the seemingly senseless good and bad in their own lives, helping us bridge the gap between our everyday conscious intentions and our deep unconscious depths. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to wrap up this explainer. Knowing that these massive, hidden contradictions are operating right now in the background of all our minds, how will you handle them? Will you just remain blind to the opposing forces within your own psyche, risking unconscious destruction? Or will you, like Job, stand firm, finally face your shadow, and demand true wholeness?